Two letters today, the letter of Titus and Philemon, or Philemon. We can have that debate later. Super excited to be back in with you and jumping into these letters. So, Tom, let's get straight into it. What is the letter of Titus? What do we see? What's going on here? I mean, we can see why it's come next to the two letters to Timothy, because it's a kind of similar vein, isn't it?
Yeah. Again, it's one of those. It's called a pastoral. And again, it's him telling a young leader, like, okay, here's what you need to do. And to me, I think Titus covers a lot of the same ground, but really uses his phrase a lot of doing good. And whether that's Titus's phrase that Paul repeats to him, or whether that's Paul's just at this particular moment landed on, this catches what Jesus came to do. He's like, come on, like, it's all about doing good. So NIV subheadings are: appoint elders, church leaders who love what is good, rebuke those who fail to do good for the sake of the gospel. You're saved in order to do good. Final remarks. So
good.
That's right.
Yeah. Little aside, I mean, he's on the Greek island of Crete, isn't he? So I was wondering if you could kind of send me that.
We could try. I mean, we could send you to Crete, and you can have a shipwreck on the way.
Shipwreck on the way, yeah. And there's some juicy phrases about those who live on the island of Crete, which is kind of interesting. But we wanted to pick out these verses from chapter 2, just as a kind of jumping off point, a little bit of a summary verse. They say this: "For the grace of God has appeared, that offers salvation to all people. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright and godly lives in this present age, while we wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Saviour, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all wickedness and to purify for himself a people that are his very own, eager to do what is good." I mean, amazing what he packs into one paragraph. It's kind of a gospel statement, isn't it?
Well, it is absolutely a gospel statement. Maybe not the traditional gospel statement, which, depending on where you grew up in church and how long you've been exploring Jesus, you may have come across something about, Jesus died for our sins, to release forgiveness to us, and then you're like, and so what after that?
Yeah.
Whereas what Paul does, actually, in all of his letters, and somehow, even though we've prioritised Paul's letters, we've lost this, is that what he says is that Jesus died. He actually isn't so concerned about the forgiveness of our past sins. What he's concerned about is the transformation of our hearts, that we become people who live like the Messiah, who live in the Messiah and like the Messiah.
So we're back to way of life.
It's the way of life, isn't it?
Yeah, amazing.
It's funny that, like, it's always nice when you come across something you think, this feels like this is what God says, and then every time you open the Bible, you're like, this is in here. Yeah. This is in this book as well, and this book as well, and this book as well. So, and then what I really like about this little paragraph is that I think there's 4 phases that Paul is sort of setting out, saying that this is the battle of the gospel taking root in somebody. You could call it a process. You could call it sort of, this plus this addition, like a formula for maths, or you could, if you're not so scientifically minded, you'd be like, this is the flow, or
the recipe.
The recipe. But the reality is that what he's saying is, the message appears, and it's a message of grace. Step 1. So if you're sat watching this, or in your life, everything begins with the appearance of grace. A message that something undeserved is available to you, and it appears to you. You don't find it, you don't go grab it. There's an appearing thing that God in his kindness reveals it to you, and it could be something from as mundane as you look at a blade of grass and you think to yourself, hold on a minute, like, this is a miraculous thing. Look at the beauty of this blade of grass. And there's a sense of grace, like, whoa, like, this points in me, as I look at this at this moment, this points to the being a creator who fashioned this and put it there for me to look at and gave me eyes to see and a brain to process the light that's going through my retina or into my nerves and up into my brain. That feels like a moment of grace. And it could go all the way to the other extreme of you open the book and you read a parable or a story of Jesus, or you hear a testimony of somebody in your life who's a real moment of Jesus. There's an appearing of grace. And to root yourself and grow yourself in faith, you keep coming back to that. Like, I want to have eyes to see and ears to hear the grace that God is showing to me today. The attention you give the Son determines who you become.
So that's number one. Grace appears in your life.
Appears in your life. Second step is this. The grace, if you look at it carefully and follow it long, and somebody is good enough to address you, either through the book or through preaching or the word, which offers information about what a life lived in this grace would look like. Now, Paul uses the word salvation. So he says, the grace of God appeared that offers salvation to all people. And again, we come back to this. When Paul says salvation, what he's not saying is this offers you the forgiveness for all you've done in the past. It includes that. It includes that. But what he's saying is he's offering you a way of being, the version of yourself that is imbued with the grace and the love and the mercy and the goodness of God. Like, salvation is, are you saved? Well, when you come to know Jesus, yes, in one way you're saved, but you are being saved as you're being transformed into being more human, into being more you, into the fullness of everything that God created you for. And as you have the grace appear, then the second phase is you begin to get in your head a picture of, this is what I would look like if the grace of God really went to work with me.
Okay.
I'd treat Andy like this. I'd respond to disappointment like that. I'd suffer like that. I'd celebrate these things. In my spare time, this is the kind of things that would be going through my mind. I deal with this. This would be the way I deal with my sexual desires. This would be the way I use my tongue. This would be the way that I use my money. Like, you begin to create a vision in your mind of, this is what it would look like to be really totally infused with the grace of God.
So grace appears, and then you begin to understand this is what it would look like. I have a vision of a grace-infused life if it's coming to me. Or we also might step it the other way, like I step into grace and all that Jesus is doing and has done, isn't it? What's number three?
Number three is then the training to do two things. So you have this vision of this is what it would look like, and then what you almost certainly, I think every single human pretty much who's ever lived has noticed that the vision of what I could be and the reality of what I am now has a gap. And how do you close that gap? And what Paul says is there's training. There's training to say no to the things that drag you away from this vision of life. So to drag you away from greed and like, I'm just going to do whatever, drag you away from the compulsive anger that you lash out at somebody. To drag you away from those things, you get trained to say no to those, and you train yourself to say yes to the things that make you more like this person. So it's training.
So very much kind of process language there, isn't it?
It's fascinating. I mean, we go back to that language that we looked at in Timothy about you're a soldier, an athlete, and a farmer.
Yeah.
This is what maybe we've lost a little bit in modern Christianity. Dietrich Bonhofer would talk about cheap grace.
Yeah.
And he didn't want that. He wanted people to train themselves, that grace would train us to become this vision of life, that we wouldn't assume that God does all that on our behalf. No, we are trained, we put in the effort, we stop doing things and we start doing things with the grace of God to help us with that.
Yeah, it's a powerful thing, isn't it, to begin to realise, not only does the gospel bring me news of being forgiven for the sin that I've done in the past, but it also empowers me to not sin in the future. And it's not just a zapping, it's also a training. Like, I am progressively going to become more godly, more upright, more self-controlled as I participate in this process that the gospel leads me forward on.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't in the notes, but just a quick Dietrich Bonhofer story because it came to my mind as I mentioned him. So there's a story that I think, I can't remember the name of the camp that Bonhoeffer used to run, Buchenwald, but I think that may not be it. That may not be it. Anyway, he was running a camp to train...
This was 1930s Germany.
1930s Germany, to train clergy, to train preachers, to be ready to go out and preach in an extremely hostile environment. Bonhoeffer opposed the Nazis. He hated what they were doing. He thought it was demonic. And he was trying to train church leaders to stand with him and preach into this context. And people would come and they had a very, very rigid day. They'd get up, they'd pray together for an hour, they'd confess their sins to each other, they would they'd dig deep into the Bible. And people would come and they'd be like, "What are you doing? This is so full on. Like, why are you being so militant about this?" And he'd take them and he'd walk them to the edge of the lake where his thing was, and he'd point across the other side of the lake to the hill. And at the other side of the lake on the hill was a Hitler youth camp, and the teenagers every day would stand there and they'd sing songs in praise of Hitler. They'd learn the laws that Hitler taught. They'd be told about how their parents weren't true followers and how they had to be turned against their parents. And he would say to these, he said, "This has to be stronger than that. This has to be stronger than that." And what he meant was, we have to have a vision of life that is actually so real that it's more attractive to these teenagers than what Hitler's presenting to them. And it's fascinating, isn't it? Brilliant picture.
Amazing. And a similar process, exactly like we said, to the farmer, the athlete, the soldier. So comprehensive, all-encompassing, all of life. Okay, so we've got 3. The grace appears, we get information, and by the information we have a vision of what it will be like to live this grace-infused life. And then we undergo this training to step into the vision more, to become what we're called to. So what's number 4?
Well, 4 is you get there.
Okay, that's good news.
And I guess that's what Bonhoeffer's doing, right? It's like you put in the training and you can become. You can become a person who is good. And that's what really Paul is saying. I mean, isn't that incredibly hope-filled that he's sending a message to Titus about these guys who he may or may not have ever met. And he's saying there will be on Crete people who do good as a way of life. They are good people. And I think that's so exciting.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Talking about the situation in Crete. Because, I mean, even the Romans were negative about the Crete lifestyle and culture. And Paul quotes one of the Cretins' own poets, chapter 1, verse 12. One of Crete's own prophets has said it. Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. So he's stepping
Not sometimes.
all the time. Yeah, just generalisation. Yeah, we talked about Paul last week, living a good life, even when persecuted, in prison, in oblivion, really, in a Roman prison, easily rejected, but he kept it. And Bonhoeffer's another good example, isn't it? You know, we'd all love to think that we'd have been there in the 1930s opposing Hitler. The odds are, well, statistically, very few did, but some did. And they were people who had this, grace has appeared in my life. I've got a vision of who Jesus is. It's training me to live, to say no to ungodliness and yes to what Jesus has taken me to. And they walked the way of Jesus. And, you know, you can pull out different historical examples of, in every circumstance, all over the globe, people have become like Jesus through the appearing of his gospel. But it's not automatic, is it? And it's not easy. What are some of the kind of stumbling blocks that we see in our culture?
Yeah, so it's fascinating, isn't it? Because Paul seems to pull out in the Timothy letters and in Titus, these are things that are going to stop people following through. This is what stops people becoming good, in the language of Titus. And the first one is bad leaders and bad teachers. And actually, that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
I remember I got I was just together with a few other church leaders, and we were talking about what are the things that are the biggest threats to people really being made disciples, and not a single person said bad teaching, which I thought was fascinating. In other spheres, you'd conservative evangelicals traditionally would be really concerned with doctrine.
Yeah.
And I think there's truth in that. There is a reality that if you teach bad things, it ends up that people don't get transformed by Jesus.
Yeah, and that's a definite concern in Titus, isn't it? Silence those who are not teaching the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a second thing that Paul said is that people ultimately find it hard to train themselves to say no to ungodliness, and so they need a helping hand. And he uses this language which is really shocking. It's like, rebuke them sharply. I don't know. I can't. I almost said I'd be horrified if I'd rebuked somebody sharply.
Yeah.
Isn't that
it's
revealing?
challenging, isn't it?
Isn't that revealing?
Yeah.
That I would still struggle now to rebuke somebody sharply, which is a direct command to somebody in my kind of position by Paul. And the reality is that, I don't know, have we become a little bit too tolerant of sin in the Western Church? We have guys who come from Sri Lanka or from Nigeria, Ghana, Brazil, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, Romania, Bulgaria, come to our church, and you can see in their eyes they are shocked that there isn't a harder line against sin. Now, I think we love to celebrate the grace of Jesus, don't we? We love it that grace appears to people who don't deserve it, and continues to appear. But I do worry that at times we actually tolerate sin not out of love for the person, but because we don't want to have an awkward conversation.
Yeah.
We don't want to have to confront somebody about something for our sake. It's not out of their sake.
Yeah.
I don't want to tell you this thing, not because if I really cared about you, I'd know that for you to become really good and become all God made you to be, I need to help you pass this thing.
Yeah.
But for my sake, I don't want you to think I'm a bad guy. I don't want you to look on me badly, so I don't say it.
Yeah.
And I've been just thinking about that as I read through Titus and Timothy.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of allergic to being seen as judgmental, aren't we? It's like one of those terrible things a Christian could be seen to be, and so many people have been put off by Christians being judgmental, and of course there's truth in that. That's why it becomes a cliche and a generalisation. But it has been it's been challenging and helpful for me going back through these pastoral letters. Even the tone of Paul is different to what I would naturally go with. And that's been a challenge to me. Like, am I putting too much sugar on things? Exactly like you say, for me, not because it's the most loving thing to do, not even because, how somebody would receive it, but simply out of my own. I don't want to be seen in that way, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge for sure.
But and I guess the promise, the gospel in this is that it's the grace that trains the person. So if we can get to the stage where, fumbling effort, trying to do it in love, kind of half say something, the grace that has appeared will use our simple effort to bring a training to the person to help them say no. And I think there is a shift in us to be like, do you know what, I've just got to put on my big boy pants and do this. This is, I've just got to do this. I remember there's a book called The 60-Minute Manager by, I've forgotten his name. He's written a lot of stuff on management.
Yeah. Ken
And
Blanchard.
It could, Ken Blanchard, and I think he has a quote in it, something like he would work with chief execs of multi-million-pound companies, and he'd say that they would allow their company to go bankrupt because they wouldn't want to have a challenging conversation with a senior head of a department about some bad practice that they were having. Yeah. So rather than this 30-minute awkward conversation, they would allow 30 million, 300 million pounds to just disappear.
Yeah.
And he was just pointing out the craziness of that.
And all the knock-on effects with lost jobs and lost livelihoods.
Absolutely.
And so on. And it's interesting just thinking about it now, looking back over my life. Actually, the only people that have been brave enough to have a awkward conversation to me now, I mean, I could probably count them on one hand, but they all come into the category for me of, well, they really loved me. Like, they really loved me. They loved me enough to be bothered to have a difficult conversation. But ultimately, I mean, and this isn't why we do it, sometimes there is rejection, but many, many times, if you love somebody enough to have that awkward conversation, it wins respect, it wins love, it strengthens the relationship. You'd imagine Paul's had some of these conversations with Timothy, with Titus, and they loved him for it.
And because, of course, we come back to the fact that the motivation is not to get somebody to obey rules. It's not even to get them to be holy, as if holiness is a negative that, in spite of the love of God, you have to be holy. No, it's because God loves you, he wants you to live this good life. And so an invitation to become holy, an invitation to be rebuked, to move away from sin, is actually an invitation to become all that God's made you to be.
No.
It's like going to the gym and the personal trainer says, "Oh, don't lift the weights like that, you'll damage your back." They're not going to stand there saying, "Hey, good job, man, keep doing it." No, they're going to be like, "Stop, stop doing that. Like, don't lift it that way. Lift it this way. Tell me about your diet, what you're eating." You really don't want to, you need to eat a good meal before you train, but not immediately. Leave this amount of space. Drink water. If you don't drink water, they'll tell you just really clearly, this is how you do this stuff well. Yeah. And it's that headspace that Paul is telling Titus to get into. Train these guys to do well. Yeah. Because there's a good life available. There's a good life available for you. God has got a really, really good life. A life imbued with, defined by his grace in how you interact with the kids you teach, with your parents, with family, and how you deal with hardship and disappointment. He's got a really good life available for you. And you can have it if you will allow yourself to be trained by grace.
Amazing. And this will go on to transform Crete, and this would go on to transform Croydon.
It would. And an example of one little life that is transformed by exactly this kind of conversation is the book of, what did you call it? Philemon?
Philemon. Next one on, we're going to jump in there. Paul's in prison, he's writing from prison.
And this other guy is brought into the prison. And
Onesimus.
And the guy's been brought into prison for some reason, we don't know exactly why. And Paul converts him. Yeah. Comes to faith in Jesus. Paul hears his story. Oh, he's a runaway slave. So, for some reason, the guy gets out of prison. And what does Paul tell him to do? Go back to your slave owner. And when you're like, what? Yeah. That can't be right. Hold on. Keep reading. Paul sends a letter with him that he carries, signed with Paul's hand, gives it to the slave owner. And it says this: "Yes, he ran away from you. Receive him as your brother. If you owe me anything, credit to him." So what he does is he changes the destiny of two people and embodies what it is to be people of the coming kingdom. All with this tiny little letter.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's a real kind of peer over the shoulder and get to see a private conversation. So why does Paul take that tack? Because there would be some people, and he even says in the letter, I could do it another way. I could just tell you, Philemon, what to do because I have authority in Jesus, but I don't want to just tell you what to do. I want to send you back. And that there'll be other people saying, kind of what we alluded to earlier, this is just awful. Like he should just be saying, do away with slave good, you're out, let's carry on with life. So why does he come to this conclusion and call for this course of action?
So Tom Wright, or N.T. Wright, writes an 1,000-page book on the theology of the resurrection, and he starts the book and ends the book in Philemon. And what he basically uses it to show is that the resurrection subverts the world, and it does it in this shocking manner. It resurrects the world because it gives you a new identity. You become, through the resurrection and the Spirit of God living in you through faith in Jesus Christ, a whole new person. But the person you become is not an entirely distinct being. You have within you your memory and your heritage and your history of who you were before you became a Christian. And so Onesimus, he was a slave. And so for Paul to honour the fact that he is now resurrected, not dead, and a totally different person living over here, it's to go back into that space, but to do so as a new individual with a new incarnation. And so what he does, he sends the details to the guy who's also a Christian, the slave owner, to say, although kind of his history is he was one of your slaves who actually ran away, now treat him not based on his history, but based on his future. And his future is your brother, your co-equal heir with Christ.
Absolutely astonishing, isn't it? For these guys, picking it up, reading it would be...
Yeah, and I guess it's hard to try and explain it, and I'm struggling. I feel like I'm struggling, but the Gospel's message is that, not that we wipe away the earth, we get rid of... It's not just you. That's not the way we do it. We redeem things through resurrection life coming into the midst of crucifixion life.
Yeah.
And so the things that are evil and wrong and unjust in the world that arouse in us like this passion and anger, and quite rightly, God's solution to that is to bring the resurrected individuals into that. Not to... help me out. How do we explain this?
I mean, what's even with Titus, but what's the category that I was brought up on, which I'm quite grateful for, is there's always the two temptations in life, and when you're even trying to walk the way of Jesus, of a legalism, let's solve the world through force and law, essentially. Paul saying, I could just tell you what to do, or what can be termed license or licentiousness, do whatever you want. Do whatever you want. So that would be another solution. Onesimus, just do whatever you want. You're free in Christ. And neither of those two paths are actually the way that Jesus subverts the world or saves the world. The way that he saves it is through love. He calls both Onesimus and Philemon to the way of love. And in their social status, that means different things for them at that time, but it brings salvation to both of them, doesn't it? And displays to the world this is the salvation that is being brought. It doesn't change the world through legislation, through a law, through this is what must be done, and neither does it change the world through, hey, grace has appeared, do whatever you want. It saves us into a way of love. And Titus is kind of an example of this is what the way of love will look like in an area, in Crete. Not a legalistic teaching, you must follow these rules, and neither a Cretan licentiousness, do whatever you want, but through redeemed people, redeemed leaders who are walking the way of love and bring the church into that. And then Philemon is the individual case of a thorny ethical issue. It's not going to save it through more law, it's not going to save it through do what you want, but it calls everybody into the way of love. Amazing. That was four chapters. so rich, and we're excited to keep going. We're probably out of time for prayer, so I'm just going to read the final verse of Philemon or Philemon. You can make your decision on the pronunciation, and it simply says this, and it's what we need. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit. We'll see you next time.